In this video, I'm going to be going through a brief sort of too long didn't read overview of the recently published, in fact published today, English version of the Code Gaia approach to double materiality under the ESRS that I've been working on with my colleagues. This is the second iteration of this document, or the second version of this document. And it was first published at the start of this year, but we've updated our approach and we are publishing an updated version. There are two main reasons why we make this publication public. The first being that we are a software provider and we have a software tool which takes clients through the double materiality process. And we want that process to be as transparent as possible. And so everything that is happening under the hood in the software in the double materiality module is explained in this methodological paper. The second reason we've produced this paper is we think that it should be as easy as possible for the users of our software to draft their sustainability statements. And we know that a number of the disclosure requirements require preparers to explain their approach to double materiality, and with access to a technical paper like this, they can use this text to help them draft their sustainability statements. And at Code Gaia, we also use this text to train our AI language models so they can extract the relevant paragraphs and sections, and we can begin to auto-populate our users' sustainability statements with the relevant sections that they can then update and quality control. So that's why we have this paper. Let's dive in and have a look. This will be a fairly broad brush overview of the entirety of the document. So if Julie Andrews is to be believed, starting at the beginning is a very good thing. And so that's where we'll start with this paper. This is the contents page, which is rather boring, but there is a reason I want to start here. And that is that the earlier version of this paper from the start of this year assumed that double materiality should be conducted in a series of steps, that it was a sequence of steps that you would conduct one after the other. Now, having conducted a number of double materiality analyses with a number of clients, we've realized that actually it makes far more sense to think of materiality as a series of processes which are iterative, that is, that they occur in overlapping sequence, and that the results of some of these processes will then have to go back and influence the other. So these are now being referred to as a series of iterative processes, and we are not promoting the idea anymore that double materiality is a series of steps that you should do one after the other. And this will become clear as we go through the rest of the paper. We have a summary section early on which covers the processes in very brief overview paragraphs, but I want to highlight this diagram which I've talked about before, at least on LinkedIn. And this is how we are mapping all of these processes together. And you can see that we've been quite explicit about identifying where the major iterative parts of this are. That is that identifying and assessing impacts iterates with your stakeholders. There is a back and forth there with your stakeholders to assist with that process. Furthermore, there is an iterative process with the identification of financial risks and opportunities and the identification and assessment of impacts. Those two processes iterate with each other, and stakeholder engagement can iterate with verification of the results of the process. There's also the ongoing definition of value chain and business model, which you would probably start at the beginning of the process, but continue refining those definitions as you go through. So no longer are we talking about something that you start and you step through it. We're talking about setting up processes which independently and dependently occur throughout double materiality. Section 2 then is the first full technical section of the paper. This is where we look at stakeholder identification and stakeholder engagement. We do talk about the way we are mapping and storing stakeholder related information in the software, as well as our suggestions for stakeholder engagement. There's a brief mention of the survey tools we're developing in the software, but we are very keen to point out that the use of digital survey tools should not be seen as the primary method for engagement. We'll come to that in a second. So the paper looks at focusing engagement based on the purpose of engagement, and here we're relying heavily on the IG1 paper, in particular paragraph 87. And we also talk about the breadth and depth concept of engagement, where you may have a large number of stakeholders, but you're not necessarily engaging them with much detail. And in fact, these kinds of stakeholders are largely engaged passively. And then you have a smaller number of key stakeholders who you are engaging in depth. And this is a diagram that I've adapted from a post by Hans van Dam on LinkedIn, actually. And I've engaged with him on this concept a little bit, and we've decided it's nice to adapt his diagram into our formal approach. One of the things we're very keen to stress is the prioritization of engagement with key stakeholders. And there are some pretty strong statements in IG1 that we draw on, namely that engagement with stakeholders who are not affected by a specific sustainability matter is not meaningful, and the idea that engagement can help with understanding severity of impacts and invalidating risks and opportunities, which we'll come to in a bit. Obviously then, specific engagement on specific impacts does not necessarily lend itself to a digital survey tool. It is much more appropriate to engage stakeholders in a workshop format or with more meaningful communication forms than simply sending them a digital email survey. The next technical section looks at the identification and the assessment of impacts, and this is where we get into EIA theory a little bit, and this is where we will go through and look at the specific thresholds that we apply during the severity and likelihood tests. One of the things that we've been very careful to talk about as well is the idea of appropriate naming and description of impacts. So rather than just listing off the sustainability matters, we encourage our clients to draft descriptions of impacts, which can help the reader understand what the changes that is occurring in the environment or identifying the specific delta, that a description of an impact should typically contain some kind of verb, that impacts could represent accumulation or sets of contributing impacts, and they could be secondary or primary, and to try and include all of those things in the impact descriptions. As with the earlier iteration of the paper, we draw on Horstman here as some academic examples of sustainability-related impact naming and description. And of course, we also show how we encourage clients in the software to provide full name, description, and characteristics of impacts at the identification stage before they conduct their assessment. Moving on then to the characteristics of the impacts. This is where it starts getting even more technical. We discuss a little bit about what positive and negative means. We look at what actual and potential mean. We cover our scale for scale, which is part of the severity test. And here we have a 3-point scale. We look at scope, which is another part of the severity test. And here, once again, we have a 3-point scale for scope. And we have very specific interpretations of scale and scope, which we believe can be used objectively. That is, you can apply objective external frameworks to measure scale and scope on these 3 points. And then we have a visual representation of scale and scope. We interpret irremediable character in terms of the time required for remediation to take effect. And then we have the severity tests shown here in these severity matrices with the irremediability baked in as well. Now, this is not a materiality matrix. Those of you who have been engaging me on this topic for a while will know that I'm not a fan of materiality matrices. This is not a materiality matrix. This is a severity matrix, and this is basically the same as the one that EFRAG has provided in the IG1 paper. Theirs is orange and yellow, ours is grey and blue. We also then discuss impact likelihood, and then we have the final set of materiality matrices. However, This is not a materiality matrix in the traditional sense, because this is simply the decision paths for each individual impact. This is not showing the results of the materiality assessment. So this is just a series of logical tests. Under what conditions can an impact be considered to be material or not material? As an addition, we have also expressed all of the materiality tests as mathematical formula. These are the thresholds. So when the ESRS says you must describe your thresholds for materiality, here are those thresholds. They are expressed as a series of mathematical formula. If people don't like the mathematical formula, they can, of course, use the visual tests as they are displayed here. But these are showing exactly the same thing. One's expressed as an image, the other is expressed as a mathematical formula. So our thresholds are perfectly understandable, and they are very, very clearly expressed in our white paper. After impact identification and assessment, we moved on to risk and opportunity identification and assessment. We cover off some of the ways that IROs can be identified. And once again, as with impacts, we talk about the way we describe risks and opportunities, and we're fairly prescriptive about how we think risks and opportunities can be and should be described. As with impacts, we go into some detail explaining the characteristics of risks and opportunities which are used for assessment purposes. And we have the materiality tests for risks and opportunities, which are here presented in these visualizations. And once again, as with impacts, the expression of those tests in a mathematical formula. These are the thresholds. The thresholds are explicitly written for anyone to see. At the end of the paper, we add in some stuff which isn't really covered by EFRAG to this point, and that is how we collate impacts. So one of the problems with multiple people and multiple stakeholders all contributing to a materiality process is that you might have lots of different people identifying the same impacts or the same risks and opportunities, but using different words and different names to do them. And at some point you want to bring those together to a single consistent set of IROs that can be assessed. So we provide a series of methodologies or a series of sub-approaches which can be applied so that you have a consistent methodology for collating your IROs. And lastly, at the end of the paper, we have an overall flow diagram, and this is the assessment path for all IROs, the characteristics which apply in each case. And I've showed this before on LinkedIn and published this in other places. This is just an overview of the assessment path for any individual IRO. There is a link now to download this PDF in the description of this video, this YouTube video. And for those who are looking at the content on LinkedIn or in other places, you can also download the PDF from the links I provide there. So I welcome feedback on this document. I'm hoping that certainly the users of our software find this really helpful, and the partners we partner with find this really helpful. And I'm keen to kind of add to the overall conversation, helping people move forward with double materiality.